Good morning. It's good to be with you again. And it's only a little while now when we'll be physically meeting together. For those of you who feel safe doing that, for those of you who don't, then these messages will keep going because we respect that. And those of you who belong to Clevedon Salvation Army and who I know about will have received a letter about that. If you would like to come but you don't normally attend with us, just let me know and I can give you details of that too. And as we begin to look forward to the future, as we begin to dream about what is going to happen, we need to learn how to see. We need to learn how to listen. We need to learn how to notice what's going on around us. And we haven't been given much choice, have we, over recent months? And I don't know about you, but I found that when I'm working from home, I notice things more. So I noticed that the kitchen needed a lick of paint, so I had to get the paintbrush out. And I also noticed that the prime time for me noticing these things is when I'm busy. So I'm busy on the computer and I noticed that there's some beautiful Irish lace across my ceiling as a crazy spider has been doing its work. And so I get my magic brush out. Then I noticed straight away when I sit down that there's a bit of dog hair on the floor, so out comes the vacuum. And then my attention is taken almost immediately by a family walking past, and just the noise the children is making and how happy they are. And then I noticed that the rain's left a mark on the window, so out comes the windowline. And as I'm doing that, I notice that some of the plants need deadheading in the garden, and the list goes on. And probably, well, I know things in normal life, I wouldn't necessarily notice those things so urgently all in one go, but I can't leave them. They need to be done because I've noticed them. And when we stop and jump off the conveyor belt for a moment and allow ourselves some space, we do begin to notice things, don't we? Not only stupid little things, like I said, but important things too. And as we look forward to coming out of this enforced self-isolation, which we've endured for the past 18 months, we can begin to dream of what the future may hold and what God has in store for us. But to do that, we need to learn how to listen, how to see, how to notice. We need to not only hear God speaking, and do you know, I think God speaks to us and God tries to get our attention far more than we've realized, because our attention isn't focused and accustomed to his voice and what he got to say to us. So we need to teach ourselves, really, and we need to practice that. It takes practice to hear from God. But it's not only time to listen to God, it's time to listen to the world too, and what the world is saying to us. Look and notice what's right under our noses, at what's happening in other parts of the world too. Pope Francis, in his book, writes this sentence: "You have to go to the edges of existence to see the world as it really is." And he was talking about the suffering in the world, not just the suffering and the loss of COVID, obviously, but about the injustice and the poverty and the exclusion and the wars and the using, which has always been part of the world. And when I read that statement, you have to go to the edges of existence to see the world as it really is, it made me think of the Salvation Army and why we're here. That's why God raised up the Salvation Army, for that sentence. On the edges of existence, amongst the marginalised, or as William Booth called it, amongst the submerged tenth, amongst those who everyone else ignores and uses and fails to notice. Those who, according to William Booth's study in The Darkest England, The Way Out, are barely existing because they are in such extreme poverty, that's where we will find God, on those margins of existence. That is the purpose God's raised up the Salvation Army for to notice and to see what's in the world around them. There's a story about William Booth, and you'd all know it anyway. But one night he was walking back from a meeting through London to his home, and he noticed that there were people sleeping, wrapped in newspapers underneath bridges. I'm not sure why he didn't notice that before, because it's always been there. But anyway, on that occasion he did, and he went home and he immediately called his son Bramwell to him, and he said, "Did you know that there's people living on the streets in London?" And Bramwell said, "Of course I knew, everybody knows." And William said, "So go and do something about it then." And that was the beginning of the Salvation Army's work with the homeless, the life houses as we now know them. They just found a premises and went with it. There was no health and safety and risk assessments in those days. They just went for it. Pope Francis says that when we go to the margins, we find a new future. And I guess that's the story of the birth of the Salvation Army. That's the work of Catherine and William Booth. They're a perfect example of going to the margins and finding a new future. Not only that, but when you think about it, when you go to the edges of existence, the margins of society, that's where we meet Jesus. Because if you think where he went when he was on earth, he hung out in those kinds of places. When God wanted to do a new thing through Jesus, God chose the places of sin and misery and exclusion and suffering and gloominess and loneliness. He chose happy places as well. He's not depressive. But that's the places God chose to go, because God knew that those are the places of possibility. He didn't choose the heights of power or the palaces of richness. God chose to do a new thing, starting in a stable amongst poor people, in the presence of the sick and the sinful, the despised and the outcast. And Jesus discovered his mission not through the direction of the rulers of that time, not through the local authorities, but through prayer, and through opening his eyes to what he saw around him as he walked the streets, and responding, not only noticing, but responding to the need which he saw there. And he was a part of that. We're a part of that. We're bound to God through creation because we're part of the world he created. But if you think about it, everyone else is part of that same creation. So we're bound together with God and everybody else through creation. And as part of that creation, we live in a reality where people plunder the earth's resources, so that nature is being suffocated by our greed. Where we live in a reality where people exist side by side. So poverty is in the same neighborhood as wealth, living in the same communities, where people are sent to the rubbish heap, essentially, simply because of their gender or their race or their class or some other thing like that, where people believe in self-sufficiency and self-preservation and are just willing to grab anything for their own riches at the expense of other people's. And often we don't think about it, because in the modern world we want things now, for one thing, but we also want them at reasonable cost. We like a bargain. We want cheap food and cheap clothes and reasonably priced furniture and all that stuff. But actually, if we want that, then somebody needs to pay the cost, and that will be people living on a basic wage or even below the basic wage, sometimes working for very long hours, just so we can have things at a reasonable cost. And as Christians, I believe that the world deserves the best of who we are. The world deserves that we look at the world around us, that we let our heart break when we think of the Rwanda Muslims or the Afghanistan people, those risking their lives to cross a busy shipping lane to get to England just because they don't feel safe where they are. And as Christians, we must see ourselves as part of God's creation, so that we don't only belong to Him, but we belong to the whole world too. If we are to dream, then maybe that dream could be that the world would reorganize to reflect this common sense of belonging to each other. A world not of haves and have-nots, of included and excluded, or privileged and pain, but of equality and care and concern for our world, for the environment, but also for each other. Listen to this story. This is in place of the Bible reading this morning because it was a very long Bible reading, several chapters, so I've just condensed it. I hope you don't mind. I do like to have a Bible reading, but this is a condensed story. You would already know it anyway. Well, once upon a time, the world wasn't a very good place to be. There was immorality. Women were used in quite dreadful ways. And the beautiful place which God had created not long before that had become corrupt and wicked and violent and just an awful place to be. And the story goes that there was only one man in amongst all those people on earth at that time who God saw as being truly good, and that was a man named Noah. And God spoke to Noah one day, and he told him that God has had enough of this violence and this hatefulness and this hurting and this abusing the planet and the people. And so God was going to destroy the earth and begin again. And so God gave Noah very specific instructions on how to build a boat, because Noah wasn't a boat builder. He worked the land, which would save himself and Mrs. Noah and their 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives as well. And he was to also take on the boat enough animals that could repopulate the world once the flood was over, because that's how God was going to destroy the world, with a flood. It was a bit of a weird conversation, and Noah was no spring chicken. And the neighbours thought he was crazy for building this big ship so far from the sea. But Noah had such faith in God that he did it because he was so obedient to God. So after he did all this, the water came not only from the skies but up from the ground, and very soon the whole world was flooded, just as God said would happen. But God didn't forget Noah and his relatives, and he soon stopped the rain, and the water stopped coming up from the ground and began to recede. And eventually the ark came to rest on a mountain, and after more than 10 months of being at sea, they eventually could step foot onto dry ground again. And I tell you that story because, in a way, COVID is our own personal Noah story. We have metaphorically been in an ark for the past more than 10 months, just as the people in Noah's time was, Noah's family. And we have been taken to this place where we can begin to start anew tomorrow. That's the place where we're at now. A place where God opens the door for us out of COVID and says, be fruitful. That is what God said to Noah. But realize that Noah's story wasn't just a path out of destruction, but it was about more than that dramatic escape. It was about what happened after that, what followed that. It was about regeneration of a new human society, about humans respecting the limits and curbing this pursuit of wealth and power, about respecting each other. It was about building a community where the poor were looked after and looked out for, and where those who before lived on the edges of community were included as equals in that community. And it also introduced this idea of Sabbath and Jubilee, where there could be moments of recovery and reparation, where debts could be abolished and relationships restored. It was a time when the earth was given a chance to bounce back, and where where hope was restored to the community. And that's the grace which the COVID arc has given us. The only opportunity to choose a new opportunity, to come out of it better than we were before, where we can develop a culture of service rather than self-sufficiency and preservation. COVID has accented the reality of the way people live their lives. It's no coincidence that poorer areas, where there's overcrowding and much more need, has come out of this far better than richer areas in terms of country and areas in our country. So bearing all that in mind, what's going to prevent us from dreaming? What's going to stop us from hearing from God, and what he has to say regarding this new thing he has wanted to do and this new creation he has wanted to bring about in us and through us? Or what's going to stop us from noticing or listening to what's happening in the world around us? What's going to block us from hearing what God has to say about that? Well, for a start, narcissism is going to be a block. When we believe that we're the center of everything, when we see the news as good or bad in terms of how it affects us only, when we aren't moved by what we've seen on the TV about people crossing dangerous seas in a boat or being bombed at airports because they are so terrified and desperate to leave their own country, when we aren't moved because it's not us, that's when God's voice is blocked to our ears. When there's narcissism, when there's discouragement, God's voice is blocked. When we lament and complain about everything, not what's real, but these made up things in our own head, that leads us to the point where we can no longer see the reality which is around us. And our lamenting and our complaining often leads to spiritual sadness, not only for us, but for those we're complaining to sometimes as well. When we choose to close off avenues of hearing God, closing ourselves off to it just affects us and stops us from hearing from God. Pessimism also blocks us from hearing from God. It closes doors to the future, of future revelation and the truth that there is something new out there, or there is something better out there. It stops us from moving ahead because, or what can be achieved, because we're afraid to open the door, because we're frightened what might be on the other side of that door. But God speaks to us from the margins, if only we would listen. Opening ourselves up to the Spirit and opening our eyes to what is we can see around us can reveal to us the little things which are in plain view, like my cobwebs in my dog hairs, things which we can do something about now. Dream big, but there's things we could do about now. Just simple things like how we can recycle our rubbish, how we can buy ethically, how we can respond to the need we see around us and our neighbours and our family and our friends, how we use our money, everything around us. If only we could open our eyes and see how we should be dealing with those things. And as we begin to respond to those small things, then that can begin in us this an ability to discern what God's will is for us and what God is saying to us. And then we can begin to see new possibilities, because we're training ourselves to listen to God. Every time we listen to God and notice God, we become better at it. And so as we first begin to respond to those things and to commit them to our minds and to open up this new way of living, to serving others, it can bring about real change in us and in our communities. Dreaming isn't only about the big things which we feel we have little power over, but dreaming is also about noticing the small things which we do have control over, which we do have power over. So let's continue to dream. and we're going to sing a song this morning. And I realised that I haven't sang a lot of Salvation Army, good old Salvation Army songs over recent weeks, and so we're going to do that this morning. So let's sing together. We've got the opportunity to sing twice this morning because I invite you to sing another song as your prayer this morning, so we can unite in prayer and it's help us build a loving world. You can hear the music playing in the background, so let's sing together.